Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the ID5 Identity 2020 webcast. My name is Matthew Roche. I'm the co-founder and CEO of ID5, and alongside me presenting today will be Scott Menzer, our VP of Product and Operations. There is 162 of you online right now. We are going to wait for another minute or two, and then we'll get started with the presentation. The presentation will be about 35 minutes long, maybe 40 minutes long, and we will have time for Q&As. You must have a chat box if you want to ask questions during the presentation. We'll be able to see them, and we'll try to address your questions as we go. And you will also be able to go back to this recording if you really enjoyed it, or more likely share it with your colleagues through the same link that you've used to log in. The webcast is recorded, so you will have access to that recording. It will also be available on our website under the resource page at id5.io. Okay, the counter of people logging into the website is, no, it's still growing. Oh, never mind. It's 3 minutes past 4 here in London, so we'll get started with Identity 2020 and the presentation of what we see as being the challenges, which you probably all are very aware of, but also the many opportunities that are related to user identification. And to start with, it's important to understand that the identity or user identification is really at the foundation of digital advertising. When we talk about identity, it's a bit misleading. What we're really talking about is the ability to individualize devices and consumers and to treat them differently from each other. And this ability is really at the heart of digital advertising, because obviously it powers everything that relates to audiences, right? The ability to track users' behavior, to understand what they do online, to understand what product they see, what content they interact with, to build profile on those marketing audiences, marketing targets, and then to address them with a personalized message. That obviously requires the ability to individualize them and to treat them differently from each other so that we can understand their behavior. That's the obvious use of user identification, but it's not the only one. It might not be the most important one from a brand perspective. The ability to deliver campaign in an optimized fashion, to do frequency capping, so control the number of times a user will see an ad, relies on user ID as well. So that's another very important application of identity or of user identification. And the third one, which is equally important for brands, is the ability to measure performance and to do attribution, so connect an advertising event, such as an impression, a view, or a click, with a marketing, a performance event, such as a visit, a conversion. So it's really a three-dimensional application that we are looking at where when we talk about identity, it's audiences, profiling, and targeting, but it's also frequency capping of campaigns, and it's also performance measurement and attribution. Those three capabilities that are really core to digital advertising rely on our ability to use IDs, different user IDs, different codes for different users. There's different ways to measure how important that is. One of those ways is to look at the Google study. Google estimated that about half, between 50 and 60% of the value that publishers derive from digital advertising is related to their ability to identify users individually, or said in other words, to use cookies. So it's roughly, if you look at the size of the open digital advertising markets, so outside of the walled gardens, about $100 billion industry. $50 billion is related to our ability to have user ID, to have cookies, and to connect with users individually. So it's a really big part of do as an industry and what we're able to provide to brands. It's actually not a single problem. We see three different kind of sides or three dimensions to what is commonly called identity. The first one is the ability to connect devices across or connect people, what we call people-based identification or cross-device identification. Right? That's a very important part of that identity work that we do as an industry. There's a lot of companies who've been created to address this problem, and it's a really important element, a really important capability that we have to provide to brands. The second one is the ability to connect online user profiles, online behaviors, with the offline data related to those consumers. It's what we call onboarding. It's really the connectivity between online and offline, another very important element or dimension of identity. But both those dimensions rely on a much more commoditized one, which is the ability to have an ID on the device. This is what supports cross-device. This is what supports onboarding. It's having a code on a computer, having a code in a browser, having a code on an app, which enables us to kind of follow this computer, this app, and treat it differently than other computers or other devices. Today, we use third-party cookies to do that in the ad tech industry. We use mobile ad IDs in apps, and this is what is at risk going forward. This is the ability to have an ID on a device, and we'll talk about that obviously in a minute. But when you look at those three dimensions of identity, again, very different approaches to identifying users, very complementary approaches to identifying users. There's only a couple of companies who do all three of them really well, and they are Google and Facebook, right? And we are convinced that this is what gives them such an advantage, such a USP over digital advertising. It's their ability to connect with consumers, to connect with to onboard their offline data, and to connect with them across devices at scale that has enabled them to grow their control over digital advertising to such level, around 70 to 75% market share, depending on reports. It's really their control of those three dimensions of identity. One number alone illustrates how important that is. For a company like Facebook, their custom audience product reportedly generated $28 billion in revenue in 2018. And this is just based on their ability to connect offline data with their online users, online audiences, right? So it is a very, very significant part of revenue compared to the $100 billion entire digital advertising ecosystem outside of walled gardens. It's a very, very important part of what makes them successful as an advertising destination for brands. The rest of the industry outside of the walled garden has mostly been using cookies on the web, and we're going to mostly talk about the web because this is where the problem is most acute at the moment. Because we've been using cookies, we've been using IDs stored on third-party cookies to identify users. And those IDs have been less than perfect. They're pseudonymous, right? So they are not identifiable information. They are usually just strings of characters, random numbers and letters to identify users. So they are what we call pseudonymous. They are temporary because third-party cookies are temporary. They can be erased easily. They can be erased either voluntarily by users or through upgrades of browsers or change of devices. They are also restricted to a browser and a device. Okay, so they don't enable us to have a consistent identification method across devices or even across browsers. And third-party cookies also are domain-specific. They are only written and readable. They're only readable by the domain that has written them, which is very important because digital advertising is an interconnected ecosystem, which means that if different platforms who are involved during the course of the transaction have different IDs, they need to match those IDs with each other. They need to create a connection between those IDs to be able to share information about a user. And this characteristics, which is intricately linked to the fact that we're using third-party cookies, is what is creating a lot of the technical issues. Because we have to do matching, we have to fire pixels, each of those pixels to be able to share user ID with each other being ad tech platforms. So every DNP, every DSP, every SSP, every three-letter acronym with a P at the end has its own ID on users and need to share that ID with its partners, right? And to do that, they have to fire a pixel on pages, on publisher pages, which creates a load on those publisher pages, latency, as well as risks of data leakage and privacy risks for publishers. So we'll talk about that in a second. This is the first technical limitation. The second is that because we have to go through matching, which is a client-side process, which creates lots of losses in translation, where we end up with a very small portion of the audiences that are actually identifiable end-to-end. So the performance of the advertising ecosystem, because we're using different IDs stored on third-party cookies, is less than optimal for that reason. The third technical challenge, this one, the elephant in the room, is that the foundation of the system, the third-party cookie, is actually going away because browsers are limiting our ability to access, whether read or write, third-party cookies. So let's look at those three challenges in a bit more details. So cookie matching first. The impact it has on publisher websites. We've worked with a company called Redbud here in the UK to understand how cookie matching impacted publishers first from a performance standpoint. The average number of pixels that are fired on pages creates a latency of up to 19 seconds. So it delays pages to fully load by 19 seconds. So it's a really, really strong impact on page performance, page latency, user experience in the end. The second problem is that basically having hundreds of pixels on pages means that you have hundreds of people who have access to data on your website, right? They have access to a user ID and they have access to a page which they can probably crawl to collect content. Matching creates a lot of risks of data leakage, which has a massive impact for publishers and creates risks of potentially having people monetizing their audiences, monetizing their assets outside of their control. So the side effects of cookie matching are very bad for publishers. The second point, the performance, right? Because we have to go through matching to be able to share information between those platforms, we're losing a lot of information, a lot of users along the way. If you look at a theoretical example where a brand's user pool, 1,000 users that are kind of the target audience for a brand, are all available on the publisher's website, which in theory represents the perfect case for the brand to be able to target their audience. In reality, because of first the fact that some browsers are going to block those users, right? We won't have a lot of users that are identifiable by the SSP in the first place, and then going through the matching process, we're going to lose anywhere between 5 and 25% of that audience at every step of the way. And we're representing here two steps, which is exchanges and DSPs, but they can be more than that. And so every time the user or the bid request goes from one platform to the other, we're going to lose a few users. And by the end of the process, once we've overlaid the target audience on the audience that's available from publishers through bid requests, we may have between 30 and 50% of the audience actually identifiable by the DSP and so addressable by the brand. So we go from 100% theoretical reach to less than 50% because of technical integration issues and because of loss in translation due to cookie matching. So those are the two main technical problems we've had to face over the past few years since programmatic advertising started, and obviously over the past a few months, browsers have imposed even higher restrictions on our ability to identify users by blocking access to third-party cookies. Chrome is Safari has already been blocking third-party cookies for about 2 years since the launch of ITP, Intelligent Tracking Prevention. Firefox has been using a block list of things that are also prevented to read and write cookies, third-party cookies, since the month of September of last year. And Chrome has announced that they were going to block third-party cookies within 2-year time. So we can see that through those restrictions, the very nature of the identifiers that we can use is at risk of not being available anymore because we won't have access to third-party cookies going forward. So very significant technical restriction already today, which are only going to get worse in the future. The other way to look at this is through a privacy angle. There is a different perception on what usage of personal data should be now, following the implementation of GDPR in Europe, following the implementation of CCP in the US, which basically all are saying the same thing. You need to ask users whether or not they're happy for you to use data. You need to give them control. And the ad tech industry, programmatic advertising, hasn't been built for that. This is something that's been very clearly illustrated by the ICO in the UK in a report they released last summer. RTB, the pipes that we're using for RTB, for programmatic advertising, for digital advertising in general, are not privacy compliant enough. And this is really an issue. And when we look at again, the results of that study that we did, a very large portion of the vendors that were monitored by Redbud and who had access to the page presented privacy risks, even when the partner was using a consent management platform and asking users to pass them consent information, whether or not they were happy for advertisers and platform data about them. But all of those signals were not even listened to, were not even used in the ecosystem. So again, privacy is a major challenge. The new normal is to include users a lot more in the advertising discussion, and the pipes that we're using through programmatic are not made for that. So massive technical restrictions, a very poor performance, side effects of cookie matching, a risk of not being able to access IDs altogether, and very strong privacy issues around the fact that we use around the type of IDs we're using today, really called for the redesign of identity for digital advertising. And we believe that we need to move to a new type of user IDs. We need to go away from native platform-specific user IDs and move to a world where, as an industry, as an ecosystem, we use shared identity solutions, shared IDs, to be able to trade with each other, as a currency to trade with each other. And this is what we have seen appearing over the past few years, and this is what we believe is the solution going forward. And to tell you more about the solution, I am going to hand it over to Scott Menzer, who's going to take you through the solutions and how we see this happening.
Thanks, Matt. So there's a number of solutions out there today that you may be familiar with. We pulled this list from the user ID modules that are available in pre-bid, which we thought was a pretty good indicator of ones that are looking to do identity in this space. The top three here, Digitrust, ourselves, and Brightpool, are really identity-focused companies or initiatives. The four along the bottom, the Trade Desk's Unified ID, LiveRamp, LiveIntent, and Parable, are all companies that have other businesses that the identity is useful to them, and so they've provided a system that they can provide to the industry, but it's not necessarily the only thing that they do. They're focused on other parts of the business as well, or other parts of the ecosystem as well. The future of Digitrust, with the announcement from Ivy Tech Lab last week about Project Rearc, is a little bit up in the air. So we'll keep an eye on that. But otherwise, we're really just looking at these 6 or 7 kind of initiatives right now that are out there. So some people say that's a lot. In reality, if you look at the grand scheme of things, we're used to seeing hundreds or thousands of companies that have IDs that we need to sync across. The fact that we're down to just a handful or 2 is a good step in the right direction. So a little bit more about ID5. Our mission has always been to provide an infrastructure for enabling publishers to throw more revenue from advertising, but doing so in a privacy-first way. That is critically important. That's the piece that's been missing for years in this industry. So we're focused on privacy first. That's the number one thing that we've built our platform on top of. The next thing is really to enable publishers to optimize their revenue. As Matt mentioned before, identity is a key part of programmatic, and without an ability to identify their users, publishers' revenues are impacted negatively. And lastly, if we can help the advertisers and the brands that are looking to target audiences do so in a more efficient and effective way, there will be more money on the table that will go outside of the walled gardens, that they don't have to spend just within Facebook or Google, that they'll be able to reach their audiences where they spend a good portion of their time. So the ID5 solution is called Universal ID. This is an ID that publishers will create and distribute. They're the ones that own it. Publishers can also be a brand. It's the website that the user is visiting. Those publishers or brands make that ID available to the platforms they work with. And we work with those platforms to connect the ID5 and understand what that ID means to them, and use it for user recognition, targeting, et cetera, as we mentioned before. And on top of all of that, when we do the creation of the ID at the publisher side, it's based completely upon the user's privacy requirements from GDPR or CCPA tools, as well as the publisher's own data protection requirements. So things like if a publisher does not want a certain platform to work with them, then we can ensure that their ID, that the user's ID for that platform is not shared. And this all sits on top of how we actually generate and share the universal ID through the ecosystem via the publishers. So touch a little bit about how that workflow looks. This is a simplified view where it's just sort of looking at the impression flow from the page through to a DSP. This gets a lot more complicated if you start looking at exchanges or the way data flows through the platforms, but we'll keep it simple for this purpose. So the user goes to a website, and if they're in Europe, the first thing that they should see is a consent management platform. The user inputs their preferences, and if there's the basic requirements to set and store cookies, the ID5 API will be called. This could be an API that the publisher installs. It can be pre-bid, whatever is on page is managing the interaction with ID5. So a call is made to ID5 along with the consent string and other signals that we need from the page, and we return back an ID. If this is a brand new user, we'll generate a new ID at that time. The API or pre-bid will make the universal ID available and pass it along from the browser into the SSPs. The SSPs will listen to that value that comes in on their ad call and put it into the OpenRTB bid request to the DSPs that they work with. There's not a formal place in OpenRTB today for that to go, but there's sort of an agreed upon extension field that generally goes. But in any case, it's passed on to the DSPs. And ID5 will work with the DSPs before that to ensure that they can understand what that ID is going to be. So this means providing them any decryption keys or matches back into their internal systems so that the DSP, when they get a universal ID on the bid request, knows what to do with that. So if we take a quick step back about kind of how IDs flow, we just kind of wanted to show where things work today and how the challenges of third-party cookies being blocked impacts what IDs are used and how that works today versus with the ID5 ID. So if we look at a very straightforward example, we assume that the user is in a Chrome browser, so third-party cookies are allowed still, and the user is going to visit two different websites, A.com and B.com. So when the user goes to the first site and they reach out to ID5 or frankly any platform, in this case, we generate an ID and we store that in a third-party cookie because we're able to. And with Prebid or our API, we'll also write it to a first-party cookie. When that impression request gets passed along to the DSP via an SSP, they're going to receive the ID that we sent back, ID 5123. If that user later goes to another website, that third-party cookie is still available. We can read from it, and so we return back the same ID, and the DSP is going to get ID 5123 as well. This is how it works today. The benefits through us are around cookie syncing and reducing the matching, but there's no real magic in linking IDs between A and B. It's a third-party cookie. So for now, that works. The last piece here is that we can use just simple cookie syncing or an encryption key to let the DSPs know what ID 5123 means to them. And again, this is sort of standard, nothing terribly complex here. If we look at how Safari works today, and if we assume that there's an SSP, ID 5 is not involved, then on the first impression from that user, the SSP would generate a user ID. It would not be stored in a third-party cookie, and it would not be stored in a first-party cookie. And the DSP is going to get ID 5 or the SSP's 123 ID. If the user goes to another page on that same domain, they're going to get a different ID because that cookie did not stick. The SSP still doesn't know who that user is, and now the DSP is going to get ID 456. If they go to another website, as you can imagine, it's another ID as well. So in this case, there are 3 different impression requests to that DSP, and the DSP received 3 different user IDs, none of which will ever be seen again. And this is why typically there's filtering happening between the SSP and DSP that would limit Safari traffic, or the DSP simply just doesn't bid on it or create users because they know that those IDs are not going to stick around, and there's no point in trying to do targeting or measurement against those users with an ID. So this is where our solution kind of can come into play and really help out. So on the first impression with A.com, again, there's no cookies. We've never seen the user, so we generate a new ID, but this time it's stored in a first-party cookie via the publisher's implementation of our API or pre-bid or whatever they're using. So what this means is the DSP gets 123 on the first request, and if the user goes back to that same domain, our ID is available, and so we can make sure that the same ID is returned back and the DSP uses that same ID. So now within a single domain, that DSP is getting the same ID every single time. So an improvement, the DSP can start doing some targeting, some basic measurement because they understand how many times they've shown the user ads on that domain. They're in a better position than they are today, where they effectively can't even target that inventory. So if the user goes to another website, there's no first-party cookie and there's no third-party cookie, and so we're sort of blind, just like we were the first time. And so we would deliver back a new ID, XYZ. And the DSP is going to get that ID, XYZ, it's a new user to them. However, using the ID5 system, we have algorithms that will try to link those two IDs. So we have deterministic algorithms that will use signals that the publisher may provide, like a hashed email, as well as other signals that we can use to probabilistically make the connection between XYZ and 123. And so doing so, if we generate a link and say these two IDs are the same person, then the next time that user comes to that B.com website, we will return back the original ID, 123, that is there. And now the DSP is going to get 123 from now on, and those two websites are now linked with a single ID. And so you can imagine if this was a publisher and a brand's website, there's now an opportunity for that DSP or the brand to do measurement or retargeting because the buy side and the sell side are now connected, which historically they've not been able to do. So how are we getting this adopted? How are we pushing this out? So the first thing is really to start with the publishers. This is a free offering to all publishers. We've tried to make it as simple as possible, and we're encouraging publishers to adopt the ID through Prebid or our API, and to work with their platforms that monetize their inventory to understand and pass it along. So that's really the first step. We need to get kind of a footprint of publishers that are supporting us and using the ID. The second piece is to try to help provide immediate value to platforms that are using the ID. So we started our business and for this reason, providing cookie matching service to platforms in the industry today that works around third-party cookies. So while the third-party cookie pool will over time reduce to probably nothing, we've been able to provide them value in working with us and leveraging that integration and those partnerships and relationships that we have. We're able to start to transition those platforms over to Universal ID, leveraging some of the same integration, some of the same tech, and making it a smoother transition to them where they can receive immediate value from improved cookie matching, but also start moving towards the world that they have to move to, which is using shared IDs with ID5. So we look at overall numbers. We have IDs on about 2.5 billion devices per month globally, about 1 billion in Europe, and 650 million in North America. So very well scaled to date. And we work with some of the largest partners in platforms in ad tech, as well as some of the big media owners. This list is not inclusive of everybody, but it gives you a good representation of the types of companies that we are working with in some capacity, whether they are using our cookie matching service or Universal ID. We are touching some of the biggest companies out there. That concludes content. I'll hand it back to Matt for a wrap-up.
Yes, thank you, Scott. There's been a couple of questions around this list of partners. So Scott was saying not all of those partners are fully onboarded on Universal ID right now and able to transact on it. We are actually going through a beta phase right now. So we have a few months of work to onboard a large enough number of partners for the ecosystem to be operational on Universal ID. We have, I think at this stage, the most adopted pre-bid ID modules outside of the trade desk. So there's pretty good adoption on the sell side, and we're working with a few DSPs. A couple of them are already live on Universal ID. We've got five or six more in the pipe that are hopefully going to join the beta phase in the coming weeks and months, so that we can roll this out and kind of start operating at scale with those initial vendors. But this is a transition that we have to go through as an industry. So we're not expecting this service to be live and fully scaled in today or tomorrow. It's a collective effort. There was a few questions on the recognition and the algorithm performance in particular. So right now we're looking at maximizing the performance, so the confidence of the recognition. And we're getting to, speaking from Nori, I think around 45 or 50% confidence, or no, 45 or 50% recognition at a 95% confidence, if that's correct. Just interrupt me if I'm wrong, Scott. So we're looking at maximizing the level of confidence, and we get about, let's say, about half of the users, half of the first-party IDs that we can connect across first-party domains. So this is about where we are right now in the algorithm. But again, this is work in progress, and as we transition, as we get more traffic, we will see a better performance of the algorithm as well, and hopefully more deterministic signal passed to us by publishers. In response to that particular topic, the type of signals we receive from publishers, which is another question that's here. Basically, the ID can be tied to anything that a publisher passes us. The obvious anchor is the hashed email, because it is standardized across all publishers. But for publishers working with a group login, we have one a publishing group in France working with us. We've had discussions for them to pass us their login ID, which enable us to connect IDs across their own first-party domain. Any kind of signal that is deterministically kind of tied to a user, we can use to power the cross-domain reconciliation logic of the service. Let me go through quickly some of the other questions. We will follow up specifically with all of the questions if we haven't addressed them. But hopefully, Google DV360. Is Google DV360 supported? Not yet. It's not that they are not supported, it's that they don't support ID5 yet. I think that's a better way to put it. We have discussions with Google and with the DoubleClick or whatever they call now team, but it's unlikely that let's put it that way. It's unlikely that there will be first early adopters of this. We believe that we are working for the open ad ecosystem before working for DoubleClick. Our solution solves for attribution. Absolutely. Again, attribution is the ability to connect an ID at conversion with an ID at impression or click. And so provided the conversion, the attribution system is able to ingest an ID5 ID, and provided we're able to connect to link the ID on the brand website with the ID on the publisher website through the method described by Scott earlier, absolutely works for attribution. You give the ID away for free to publishers. Can you explain how you make money? Yes, we charge platforms, ad tech platforms, for the ability to decrypt the ID. So this is mostly a DSP feature. It's in most cases DSPs are the one that have to decrypt the ID, and so we charge DSPs a monthly license fee for the ability to decrypt the ID. ID5 business model I just touched on. How you plan to integrate domestic messaging into the solution on the publisher side? So one question is, how do you plan to integrate deterministic identifiers such as email into the solution on the publisher side? So this is one of the variables that we can ingest on the call to our service, the call that returns the ID5 ID. We can ingest hashed emails or other deterministic signals alongside the consent string. And provided we have consent, use the email to anchor the ID and potentially link it across domains with other IDs coming from other publishers. Okay, that's a lot of questions. I'm not going to go down the whole list of questions, but we will make sure we will address each of those questions individually by email. Are browsers going to allow publishers to exchange user data with that tech company in the current climate behavior, even if a CMP is in place? What browsers are going to do is anyone's guess at this stage. They are the gatekeeper, so they can remove everything. I think they break a lot more things than just advertising if they remove everything. There has been some discussions with the W3C around the standardization of user agents, which is one of the signals that is available to us to link IDs when we have consent across publishers. And this proposal has been very, let's say, pushed. There's been a lot of pushback on this proposal because, again, user agent is used by consumers to be able to customize their content and how they present content to their visitors. There have been discussions around kind of masking IP addresses, which again raises a lot of concerns around fraud detection, around geolocation of content and services. So it's very easy to remove access to third-party cookies, and it breaks mostly advertising and about nothing else, or let's say targeted advertising and about nothing else. It's very difficult to remove everything else. So yeah, worst comes to worst, we can work on a fully server-side basis. The call to us to the API can be done server-side. The ID that we return can be stored in database by the publisher. ID5 does not have to be on the page, so we don't have to be in the browser. It's not the best case scenario because we lose a lot of information when we do that, but it works. We have questions about some more specific. Will there be an update list available on onboarded exchanges, DSPs? So you can see the exchanges, the SSPs that work with ID5 by going to the prebid.org website. That list is public. We are happy to provide you with an updated list over email as we. And if you register to our, actually that's a good marketing call. Register to our newsletter, and you will get updates about new partners joining the ID5 graph and new partners supporting the ID5 ID. So there you go. Shameless plug. All right, I'm getting to the end of that list. Are we supported by the IAB? That's a very good question. We are. So ID5 is a member of the IAB Tech Lab. The Tech Lab, as mentioned by Scott, kind of redesigned its strategy around identification earlier last week, actually, at the IAB leadership meeting. And they are kind of putting forward guidelines and best practices around what identity should look like in a cookieless world, which we think is a very, very good effort. The principles, some of the principles they're putting forward are privacy, are accountability, are alignment with the transparency and consent framework. All of those things we are 100% aligned with, and we think it's a very, very good, very important effort to be able to organize the space and to define what identity should be and shouldn't be. Yeah, we are very much in line with what the IAB has been putting forward and what they're trying to do with Project Rearc. We think the education effort is important, and this is what we're doing this. So their idea of having a campaign to support publishers and present the value exchange between advertising and content is also important. So yeah, that's the position that we have, and again, we're trying to work closely with the IAB to make this happen. Do we need consent for the user to use ID5, or is legitimate interest a possible way? So ID5 as a data controller requires consent. We don't have a relationship with users. We cannot claim legitimate interest for ourselves, and we are doubtful that any ad tech vendors can defend legitimate interest as being the legal basis for processing personal data. In any case, provided we have consent, we will return the ID, and we will provide this ID or the decryption capability for that ID to anyone who has a legitimate, a legal basis to do so. And so if a vendor has a legal basis that is valid, they will have access to the decryption key. Our recommendation, our preference is for this legitimate legal basis to be consent. But again, this is a vendor position. I totally understand, and we understand, and we actually encourage publishers who adopt a legitimate interest, because the trade-off between content and data seems to be fair. And it's possible for a publisher to store an ID based on legitimate interest if they deem this to be their legal basis. But again, as ID5, we operate on consent, and we only store that ID on our side if we have consent. What is the advantage for publishers to choose ID5 over other ID providers like IAB, Trade Desk? What do you see the largest hurdle to becoming the dominant ID in the programmatic space? So it's, we encourage adoption of shared IDs because we believe this is the way forward. ID5 is one of the solutions. Obviously, we believe it is a strong solution, and where our neutrality is very important, and the fact that we are not doing anything else apart from providing an ID. We're not a buyer. We're not a seller. We don't do data. We don't do we don't do profile. We don't use your profile. We're not a trading desk. All of those things are out of our scope, and we want to keep it that way because we believe neutrality is important. So what we have to provide to publishers is a fully neutral solution, a publisher-centric solution, to continue to present audiences to buyers at scale. Other operators in the space have slightly different position, where we believe our position is stronger because it doesn't create any conflicts of interest. There's no barriers to adoption of the ID5 service. Other deterministic signals besides hashed email, I mentioned login IDs. There's a lot of publishers or even kind of industry groups putting together login services. Solutions like NetID in Germany or Nonio in Portugal, Passmedia in France, right? Like national ID or login services could provide us with a deterministic key to connect users across the domain participating in this. So this is one of the signals we can take, a login ID. We can take potentially an encrypted phone number or any other kind of signal, provided that this is something that can be given to us by more than one publisher. Will the ID5 cookie be set as same site equals lax? Do you think Fold will continue to support same site equals lax? This is, I don't see why Chrome wouldn't continue to support same site equals lax. And today, and I'm looking at you, Scott. I don't know if you're still online. I think we do provide the response to the ID5 cookie is when it is a third-party cookie, right? So in the current system, we respond as a secured, provide a secure response, and we set it as same site equals lax. Is that correct?
I think it's same site none.
Same site none.
Yeah.
Same site none. Yeah. Okay. I think will frequency capping be possible in the cookieless world? Okay, that's the last question. Frequency capping is possible in a cookieless world if you use an ID that is consistent across domains, such as the ID5 ID. Or if you use whatever comes out of the Google Chrome privacy sandbox eventually, which might enable you to do capping, maybe at cohort level. Right. We'll go through each individual question. Thank you very much for your engagement and for attending this webinar. As I said, the recording will be available on that link in a few minutes. If you have any question, contact at id5.io or Scott or myself via LinkedIn. And thank you again for your participation, and we hope to hear from you soon. Thank you very much.